Let me start by, first of all, thanking the Brazil-Africa Institute and Professor Monte for organizing this conference. I think it's a very good starting point for deepening our collaboration. I'd also like to echo what my president said this morning. He would have loved very much to be here, but conflicting engagements made it difficult for him to come. What I'm going to do in the next 10 or 15 minutes is to set the stage for what my colleagues who are sitting around on this table will present before you after the coffee break. And a lot of what I'm going to say will echo what the President talked about this morning. First, there's a lot of misunderstanding about what goes on in Africa. There's a tendency to talk about Africa as one country, where the fact of the matter is that Africa is 54 very, very different countries. And as the President mentioned this morning, more than 20 of these countries are growing at 5% plus every year. As the graph on the right-hand side shows, Africa is well on its way to becoming a middle-income continent. And you can see the per capita incomes and how different they are depending upon the country that you are looking at. But that's not to say that the continent does not face challenges, right? There are many challenges. And if you look at the high fives that are central to our strategy on the continent, you will see that they address these challenges. The fact that there is a significant infrastructure gap, which some speakers talked about in the earlier session. The fact that there is food insecurity, the fact that the business environment is weak, the fact that the continent has small markets and there is a need for regional integration. In fact, coming here, I'm very, very impressed by what Brazil and Paraguay were able to do in the energy sector, and that's a lesson for us to take back to Africa. And finally, the high inequality and the limited opportunities for the youth and women of the continent. So these are challenges which form the basis of the strategy that we have developed for the continent. And I'm going to talk to you about all of these because the world is very linked. You cannot talk about agriculture by itself. If there isn't infrastructure, there isn't agriculture. If there isn't energy, there isn't agriculture. If the business environment is not good, there isn't agriculture. So the reason I would like to dwell on each of the high fives really quickly is because of these interlinkages, and then my colleagues will talk very specifically about things like agriculture, agro-industry, and so forth. Now, let's look at the first area, which is, I'm going to skip this. This just shows on the left-hand side the Sustainable Development Goals and how these 5 priorities are linked to that. So I'm not going to talk about that. The slides are available for you to take a look at. So the first one is energy, and this is why I think having this conference in this location has actually been pretty inspirational for us. Looking at this 14,000 megawatt power plant is the kind of thing that we want to encourage happening on the continent. It's absolutely ridiculous that per capita consumption of energy on the continent is about 181 kilowatt hours a year, when the per capita consumption in the US is more than 12,000 kilowatt hours per year. That just shows the amount of imbalance that exists between how energy is consumed across the world. On average, about 30% of the population of the continent has access to energy, and this is not a situation that can be allowed to continue. So as the President mentioned this morning, the challenge that we have is how do we make sure that we can provide universal access, which is that graph on the left-hand side, universal access to every citizen of Africa by 2025. The Sustainable Development Goals say we should do this by 2030. At the African Development Bank, our goal is to try and do it by 2025, which means we have to try and get 160 gigawatts of electricity generated additionally over the next 10 years. This will require $60 billion a year. The continent right now is only investing half of that, and so the challenge for us as a multilateral bank is to see how we can partner with the private sector to bridge that finance gap, okay? We don't have the time to talk about these things in detail, but that is the single biggest priority. And the energy sector's importance to agriculture cannot be overemphasized. It's extremely important. Now, the subject at hand, what you're talking about here, agriculture. My colleague Chiji will talk about this later on after the coffee break, but look at the graphic on the top left-hand side. 60% of Africa's population depends upon agriculture, but agriculture only generates 20% of the income. This is why there is poverty across the continent. And why is that the case? Look at the graph on the bottom left. For every commodity that Africa produces, its yields are extremely low. In some cases, 10, 15, or 20% of what the best practice globally is. We know how to solve these problems. We know the technology. In the previous session, it was pointed out how Brazil was able to do this. There are other countries in the world that have been able to do this. Why is Africa not able to do this? And that's at the heart of the Feed Africa strategy that we have developed, and Chiji is going to talk to you about this. Africa should be not only feeding itself, but it should be exporting to the rest of the world. And yet, in 2015, Africa's net food import bill was $35 billion. That's the graphic on the left-hand side. We project that if the situation continues as is, by 2025, Africa will be importing, or net food imports will be $110 billion US. Clearly, there is something wrong with that. For a continent that has 60% of the world's arable land, plenty of sunshine, plenty of water, why should Africa be importing food, right? And we list on the right-hand side some of the top 10 commodities. And in fact, there are 18 commodities that account for 90% of these imports. And so at the heart of our strategy is to help the continent develop the value chains for each of these 18 commodities. And this is why we would love to partner not just with organizations in Brazil, but particularly with the private sector in Brazil and the other parts of the world, because without the private sector, without the right technology, this transformation will not take place. Now, let me move on to the next area, and I'm going to skip this because Chiji is going to talk about this, is the Industrialize Africa part of our strategy. And in particular, agro-industrialization, because I think that is what offers tremendous potential, and one of my colleagues, Madame Diallo, will talk a bit about this later on. The graph on the top right-hand side shows that over the past decade, over the past 10 years, there has been no change in the share of Africa's contribution to global manufacturing. It has remained constant at about 1.5%. Africa is exporting raw products and is importing finished products. And that is not a situation that is healthy for the continent. It's another reason why the continent remains poor. We're living in Abidjan in Côte d'Ivoire, and the Prime Minister over there likes to tell the story of cocoa. Basically, Côte d'Ivoire is the world's largest producer of cocoa. The chocolate industry is an $80 billion industry a year, and yet Africa only gets $10 billion of that $80 billion. Africa has got to stop exporting cocoa and has got to start exporting chocolates. That is what is at the heart of our industrialization strategy for the continent. And again, I don't have the time to get into this. My colleagues will get into this a little bit later after coffee. But once again, partnership with the private sector is of critical importance in this area. The President talked about Integrate Africa. The graph over there compares the amount of trade within the region that takes place in other parts of the world, right? In Africa, it is only 15%. In Asia, it is 51%, and it is 71% or 70% in Europe. We have a goal to transform this 15% into 50% in the next 10 years. And we are trying to do this by encouraging the types of projects that we are seeing over here. Collaboration between countries on energy, on transport, and not just that, on the free movement of goods, services, and people. Very recently, Africa announced the introduction of an African passport, where citizens of Africa will no longer need to get visas to go from one place to the other. And I believe our president was one of the first recipients of the African passport about 2 to 3 weeks ago. These are small steps to be taken to try and integrate Africa. Because when you look at countries, there are 54 countries in Africa, some of them very, very small. Last night at dinner conversation, I was talking to a colleague who made the presentation who was saying, well, they operate out of Rwanda, but Rwanda is a very small market. And my suggestion was, don't think about Rwanda as a small market, think about Africa as a large market, but Rwanda is your entry point into that market. So how do we make sure that we can integrate Africa so that whether you enter through Angola or you enter through Mozambique or you enter through Rwanda, you're tapping the African market. This, people talk about, what do you mean when you talk about improve the quality of life for the people of Africa? This is everything. It is everything. It is health, it is sanitation, it is water. But for the African Development Bank, the most important part of this is jobs. Today, Africa needs to create 11 to 12 million jobs a year. Africa is only creating 3 million jobs a year. So the employment gap is about 8 million jobs a year. How can we help the continent bridge the gap? Once again, this is where the importance of agriculture and agro-industry comes in, because we estimate that 40% of these jobs will have to come from the agricultural sector. We've developed a strategy, as the President mentioned, the Jobs for Youth in Africa strategy, and we have a very, very optimistic goal that over the next decade, we will help create 25 million jobs. On the right-hand side are the logos of some of the companies and the private entities that we are partnering with through a variety of instruments. We are trying to create a $5 billion fund through which we hope to train the youth of Africa. Chiji will talk probably about the youth program, Enable Youth program in the agricultural sector, where several countries across the continent, I believe it's 30 countries, have signed up for as part of this particular intervention. Let me go on now to talk not so much about, I already mentioned the 25 million jobs, but to talk about a couple of the cross-cutting challenges that we face. Climate change is here to stay. Later this month, we'll be getting together in Marrakesh to talk about COP22. As you can see from the red in the middle of that map over there, Africa will get disproportionately impacted by climate change. And therefore, it is very, very important for us, whether we talk about the energy sector or the agricultural sector or any other kind of investment on the continent, it has to be climate smart. As far as we are concerned, we intend to increase our climate financing to $5 billion a year by the year 2020. 40% of all project approvals done by the African Development Bank will be climate smart. And again, this place where we are is an excellent example of how you can generate the 14,000 megawatts of electricity and yet do it in an environmentally sustainable manner. Gender is critically important to the continent, especially in the agricultural sector, as most of the production is done by the women of Africa, and yet they are the most discriminated against, whether it is in terms of access to land, whether it is in terms of access to finance. This is a key constraint that we have to try and deal with, and we have developed several special programs that are targeted at providing women with access to capital, access to land, access to training, so that we can transform how women across the continent do business. There's a lot of discussion about fragile countries across the continent. Roughly about 20% of the population lives in fragile countries. These are extremely small economies. Several of them are post-conflict economies. And we have a very special program which is particularly aimed at transforming fragile states. I don't have the time to talk about this, but for us, it is particularly challenging to bring private sector investment into fragile states. We would love to partner with the private sector in doing this. We would love to talk to you about this so that if you want to invest in Sierra Leone, if you want to invest in Liberia, tell us what it'll take. We would like to partner with you and tell the private sector that if you feel that the risk of investing in fragile states is very high. Last night I was sitting at dinner with a very brave entrepreneur who's investing in Sudan, and we need more entrepreneurs like that. But it is our role as a multilateral organization to make sure that we can de-risk investment. And we are developing several de-risking instruments to partner with the private sector to do just that. And then there is the question of governance. A lot of people talk about governance across the continent as not being very strong. We are focusing on 4 very specific aspects of strengthening governance across the continent: improving the business environment, improving economic and financial management, improving natural resource management, and making sure that we can stop the illicit flow of finance from the continent. We think that by doing this, we will be able to increase the amount of resources that Africa generates for itself. Because the future of Africa's investment lies within Africa. Yes, foreign investment will be important. Yes, private sector investment is important. But the most important source of financing, as is the case in most countries of the world, will be the country's own revenues. And that is what we are hoping to augment. So this was sort of a brief bird's eye view of what our strategy is all about and how we are approaching development across the continent. Unfortunately, I don't have time to answer difficult questions that you will raise, but all my friends over here seated on this table in the next session will answer all the questions for you. I thank you very much.